I thought this was going to be like a side room, but I think this is actually a bigger audience than the main stage at the first replay. So hopefully I'm ready for the, thanks for coming out and saying hi. Okay, so this is a like topic that I think is important to a lot of you here, and so I'm excited to present. We are talking about safe deployments, and I want to tell you a little bit about the project that's going on at Temporal, what its status is. I'm going to introduce two concepts to you that you will need to understand to get the rest of the talk. And then I'll start talking about the design that we have in progress and some of the stuff that we've built. And then we'll switch to Jacob to do a demo, and then I'll follow up with stuff that we are not yet ready to demo. We're going to have about a few minutes at the end for Q&A, so be ready with questions. Okay. So our goal here is to make people's deploys safe, upgrading workflows that are in process to new versions without messing it up, or deploying new builds without messing up existing workflows. And our North Star is to help people who are doing automated, zero downtime continuous deploys, not because all of you are doing that, but because some of you are, and that's sort of the hardest set of use cases for us to have to deal with. And we're really thinking about this problem at two layers. There's going to be the API layer, which Temporal provides, which will allow you to build your own deployment system for your workers on Temporal. And then the second is like higher level, easier to adopt out-of-the-box solutions, such as the one that Jacob's going to be demoing today, the experimental one that Jacob's demoing today. I don't want to oversell anything. We've shipped a couple early experiments. We've gotten validation from customers that yes, this is a valuable direction. I'll talk about pinning, and pinning is valuable. We're looking for ways to broaden the market appeal of these solutions and make it so that more people can access them. We're still iterating, and we're here to really invite you into the community as design partners and feedback givers and triers out of things. And so we're here to connect. Okay, so I said two concepts. Number one, pinning. So what you know of as workflows today, assuming you haven't touched any of our experiments, is you could call unpinned workflows. These workflows can float between different versions of the code. The problem with these, as many of you are familiar with, is that you have to patch your code to make sure that they can be replayed safely on new builds. You also have to maintain interface backward compatibility between your activities and your workflows. And so if you've got an activity running on one build and a workflow running on another build, you have to make sure that those are kept compatible. Pinning is the mode that we are introducing, which is the ability of a workflow to just stay put on one build. And so it's a much simpler thing to reason about because you know in most circumstances your workflow is just going to complete on your current build, and you don't have to think about patching. So, okay, so that's concept one. Number two is something that many of you probably haven't thought about, which is like there's different flavors of deploys. The traditional type of deploy that people use for stateless services and for workers today is called a rolling deploy. In this type of deploy, you've got, say, 10 workflows, 10 workers, and you're going to just like zip through them and upgrade the builds in place as you're doing a deployment. But if you want to roll back, then you have to kind of do that process in reverse, which is time consuming. And so a blue-green deploy, what it does is it makes a full replica set next to your existing deploy. And now you can dynamically route traffic between those two builds. And so if you do need to roll back, you can do so instantaneously just by doing a dynamic configuration. And rainbow deploy, which I have found very few people are familiar with, but you can read literature about it online, is like blue-green, but there's more builds, so 3 or more builds. And the great thing about rainbow deploys is they're very compatible with pinned workflows. And so part of this talk is going to be kind of selling you on rainbow deploys, which we know is not something that the industry has really circled around yet. Okay, so sales pitch one. I want to talk about why rolling deploys and pinned workflows don't mix. So if the Star Wars characters in this image are workflows, and they've got plenty of room to run, but now your rolling deploy starts like moving builds to the new version, and they start to have to execute on smaller and smaller numbers of workers. And unfortunately, that they will eventually get squeezed out, and they will just get paused effectively because there's no workers available to run them because they're pinned on a build that no longer exists. So you can start to see how your deployment system needs to be a little smarter if you're going to be using pinned workflows. It needs to be able to kind of keep old builds around for longer to let those, we call it draining old workflows. Okay. Sales pitch 2 for rainbow deploys. Why is blue-green not enough? Why do we need a third build? Okay. I'm glad someone got the joke. So just a quick example, you're doing a deploy, and now it's very easy to end up in the state where you kind of need to keep both of your builds around. The first build, so let's say you did a deploy, but like there's a bug, and some of your workflows are failing on the new build. So you roll back, and so now all of your workflows are being targeted to the first build. So they need to stay they need to stay in the first build, but there are some workflows that are running just fine in the second build because you started running them during your deploy. And so you kind of need to keep both of these builds around as you do your fix. So when your fix rolls out, rather than needing to blow away one of your 2 slots, you now add a third set of workers, and then you can start moving workflows over to that new worker set and draining the other ones. And so this is going to let you maintain 0 downtime deploys because you don't have to make choices about which of your previous builds to blow away until you're ready to do so. And then you sunset those old builds and you've deployed. Okay, so I hope that gives you a little bit of a feeling for rainbow deploys. So our project is called Safe Deploys, and we're doing a bunch of stuff to help you deploy safely. Some of them are going to be for for rolling deploys, because we understand that not everybody in the industry has moved to rainbow deploys, and we want to make improvements for people who can't or don't want to change their build systems. But we're also kind of thinking more about the future, which we think really is rainbow deploys, and a bunch of things around pinning workflows that need rainbow deploys to really be safe and awesome. So we're going to go through each of these boxes. First, Jacob is going to be doing a demo of some tech that's based on our early experiments where we've shipped the ability to ramp traffic from an old build to a new build, and where we support pinned workflows. Jacob.
Sweet. Thanks, Drew. So, actually, Drew, can I have the... Thanks.
Fine.
Okay, so to actually use worker versioning in real life, there is still some process that you have to take into account. So it kind of boils down to, 1, you have to create a new worker deployment and be careful not to spin down your existing workers. Then you need to wait for that deployment to be healthy before you start sending it traffic. After that point, you can actually update the default version in Temporal so that it starts directing new workflow executions to that new version you just deployed. Then you want to wait for your existing workflow executions that are pinned to that old worker version to finish draining by waiting for them to finish execution. And then it's actually safe to scale down the old version of your worker. So we want to make sure that this is a repeatable process, that it's easy to automate, and that it's safe, so that anytime you roll out a change and decide, oh, I actually want to roll it back, you can do that without needing to worry about it too much. And you can also just configure your continuous deployment system to roll out temporal workers as frequently and often as you like. So to make this easier to do at Datadog, we've been working on a Kubernetes controller. And Kubernetes controllers implement something called control loops, which just allow you to continuously monitor a system and make changes to achieve the desired state that you want. And so in our case, our desired state is to always have all workflow executions running on that latest target version of our worker. And we are heavily invested in Kubernetes at Datadog already, so it made a lot of sense to use Kubernetes for this, but it provides a great way to build control loops like this, and it's also a nice way to have APIs to program your infrastructure, so it's well suited for this. Okay, so I'm now going to see if I can show you some real live code. Okay, so what we're looking at right now is a dashboard that's showing two things. On the top, we've got a graph of the workflows that are being started right now. So in the background, I'm applying some load. And so these are all workflows being started. And then on the bottom, we've got the number of workers that are actually running. And I'm sure you can't see this, but this is one worker instance or one pod in Kubernetes. And so these are going to be color-coded by worker version. And what I want to do is roll out a new version of my worker. But before we do that, this is actually what it looks like to configure my worker for Kubernetes. So we've defined a new temporal worker resource type that the controller is managing. And otherwise, the configuration probably looks pretty similar if you've used Kubernetes deployments before to create temporal workers. We have a pod template that defines our worker configuration. And we also have some connection parameters like the task queue and the temporal namespace to connect to. So the worker that I'm executing right now is just this hello world workflow. It's pretty simple. It sleeps for 60 seconds, and then it returns a result. And so what I want to change here is actually the way I implemented my sleep was in an activity, just using time.sleep. And I know that there's actually a nicer way to do this using the temporal SDK. I'd like to switch it over to a workflow sleep. And so normally if I was going to do this without worker versioning, I would need to go through this process of making multiple changes and deploying them and waiting for them to roll out and have those old workflows finish running. So this is called patching in most SDKs. In the Go SDK, it's called versioning. So I've got this conditional statement here, and if I'm on the new version of the workflow, then I'll implement the sleep with workflow.sleep. If I'm on the old version, I'll execute the activity. But I don't want to do this. I want to go straight to my workflow.sleep call. And let's see what that looks like when it rolls out. So I'm going to deploy this, and what we're looking at here, by the way, is the deployments that are running in my namespace, and also on the top we've got the worker. So right now we've got a target version that's 674, and a new deployment just came up for it. And as soon as that's healthy, we switch over to that being the new default version. All right, and then we still have the existing worker deployment running, and it's going to keep running until all of the workflows that were started on it have actually completed. And so if we go back to our dashboard, we can see that there are some new workflows being started on that new worker version. And if we go and look at the related workflows in the temporal dashboard, we can see that there are just over 100 still running right now, and that's actually just going down, and the number of completed workflows are still going up. So we're still running those old workflows that are sleeping using the activity. And so that new worker's been up for a little over 60 seconds. So in a moment, those workflows should have all completed, and that deployment's actually now scaling down. And I didn't have to do anything. I just updated to the version that I wanted. So let's roll out one more time, but I also want to show a different rollout strategy. So right now we are using the all-at-once strategy. So immediately as soon as that new worker version is healthy, we're cutting over 100% of new executions to run on that version. But there's also a progressive rollout strategy. So I just switched it over here. And this allows us to define a series of steps for our rollout. So we can incrementally ramp up the traffic in terms of new workflows being started on that new version over a period of time, and have actually multiple active versions running that are starting new workflows. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to make one more change to my workflow code. I'll say hello replay instead of hello world. And let's deploy that and see what happens. So again, we're going to create a new deployment resource. As soon as that becomes healthy, we're going to change our, we're actually not going to set it to the default, but we're going to see this target ramp value start to go up. So this is representing the percentage of new workflow executions beginning on that new version. So now we're at 5% of new executions starting on that version. Over the next few seconds, it's going to go up to 50% and stay there for a little while. And again, we're just going to wait until all of the workflows that were on the previous version are no longer running before we scale that down. And of course, once that that ramp period expires, this new version is going to become the default. And just so we don't have to wait around for too long, we can see a small number of workflows starting here, but I've got a screenshot of what that looks like right here. So we can have as long of a period as you want to be able to evaluate a new worker version. You can implement that with a progressive rollout strategy. Cool. So let me go back to the slides. There are a few future improvements that we want to make, some very soon. So one of those is that we'd like to be able to create deployment test hooks for you so that you can do kind of canary analysis on new worker versions before you ever start sending any real production traffic to that new version. So we'd be able to spin up a new version and then allow you to start a new workflow automatically that can run some synthetic checks. We also would like to be able to do production replay tests. So Drew's going to talk about this a little bit more in a moment, but we want to be able to find out if any workflows are actually incompatible before we roll out a new version, if you have really long-running workflows that you want to make sure can actually move between versions safely. And we also want to implement horizontal autoscaling, and this is enabled by some new temporal server APIs that just shipped in the last release that allow you to get statistics about the task queue backlog and task add rate. And that's actually broken down by version within the task queue. So we can, if you have a very large pool of workers, we can actually appropriately scale each independent version of your worker appropriately so that you're not paying a huge cloud bill. And I'll hand it over to Drew to talk about the rest.
Thanks, Jacob. So for the deployment test hooks and the production replay tests, we want those to be available not just within this controller, but like to make it easy for people, for you to do. We've had a number of customers kind of do those things the power user way, and by like shipping a whole Kubernetes pod and all this stuff, and we want to make it easier and built in. Okay. I want to talk a little bit more about pinned workflows. We've talked about pinned and unpinned as strategies, and it turns out there's no one-size-fits-all solution here. And so we're introducing an annotation, or we will be introducing an annotation called that lets you decide whether a workflow is pinned. If it's pinned, that tells you as the developer that you do not have to patch it and maintain interface compatibility. If it's unpinned, that tells you that you do. How do you choose? Well, assuming you're using Rainbow deploys and it's safe to actually be pinning workflows, the litmus test is basically short-running workflows get pinned. Long-running workflows are a little bit more complicated. If your workflow takes a month to run, you probably don't want to be keeping builds around for a month. You want to be upgrading that in process. And so if you have a long-running workflow, you can either keep it unpinned and patch it as you have been, and we'll be making that better, but it will still fundamentally need patching. You could also try some strategies that some customers use of trampolining it from build to build. So when there's a deploy, for example, you could signal it, tell it to continue as new, it'll continue as new onto the new version. And that will sort of limit the amount of interface compatibility you need to maintain to that sort of continue as new step. I do want to point out that for workflows that get stuck, that may have been short running normally, but then there's some bug that causes them to keep in a retry loop, you may need to patch those. And so patching is not something that exits your toolbox, even if you're using this. But hopefully it's confined to things that are only remediation of bugs. OK. So one more thing, replay tested redirects. So we've talked about how we have a deployment system. It starts with the dry run that does some replay testing to make sure that your deploy is going to go smoothly. But that's fundamentally based on the sampled data from production. And it's not comprehensive. It also lags in time before you're actually starting to move these workflows over. But what if you could actually do replay testing as part of your deploy when you're actually ramping traffic onto the new machine? So imagine you've got a build, it's running a bunch of workflows. You roll it out, the new build, and you start just by doing, each workflow sort of starts by doing a replay test, just as it normally would. And, but the difference is, if it fails, we're going to kick it back to the old build. And the only hit you've taken is a diagnostic telling you that this happened and a latency hit. Or you could choose, if you see any of these, you could choose to stop the deploy in its tracks. And so this sort of atomic replay test that allows you to sort of dynamically pin workflows back to the old build, we think will be a very powerful addition to our toolbox. So this is a recap of our safe deploy strategy. There's a bunch of stuff we're building. We haven't necessarily picked the order in which to build these things. There's nuances to each of them. And so this is where we especially want to hear from you what you're excited about. And to that end, there is a Slack channel that's been set up called Safe Deploys in the Temporal community Slack. Please join it. That's where there's going to be, news, feedback, et cetera. And that's where the community is going to be hanging out. So we know this is like, personally speaking, this is probably the biggest design challenge I've ever worked on. And we need the community to really be helping us because we know there's a very diverse set of deployment systems and needs on our audience. So this is not one of those things where everybody can just sit back and assume that it's going to be delivered great. We really need your help. So thank you. And we are ready for questions.
If you have a question, raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you. You've made it easy.
I guess just a gut check, but from what you showed, it feels like the combination of the pin flows plus the controller actually makes it much easier potentially to move from a rolling deployment to blue-green to rainbow. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, that's exactly the hope. Is we want it to be easy. So if you're using a rolling deployment right now in Kubernetes and you have a deployment resource that you're configuring, the worker controller is designed to basically drop in your existing configuration, and there's some small tweaks you need to make, but then it should just work in theory. It is very, very alpha. Please don't use it in production, but yeah.
Yeah, same on the current worker versioning APIs we've shipped. They are in alpha. I want to just add that if you do not want to use that controller, it's a reference app for you to use if you need more flexibility to integrate it into your own deployment system, or you don't use Kubernetes. Yeah.
You kind of answered my question. It's very, very alpha, but can you share some more insights into how long you're expecting, or what help or community help that you're looking for? We are very interested. I'm from Salesforce. We have this problem that we want to solve for our customers, and happy to contribute, and maybe I'll ping you on Slack as well.
Yeah, that's amazing, and I've spoken to a lot of you and folks from other companies who are interested. So I just demoed the Happy Path. There are tons of different edge cases. Like, please try it out and tell us how you broke it. And there's a lot to figure out to actually really productionize it and make it ready for it to be super stable. But just try it out.
Okay, you said that we cannot use pinning for long-running workflows. I understand the challenge, but would it be easier, at least in the future, somehow you can make it easier to reset existing workflows so we can get rid of the versions or something like that? So eventually when you have a lot of versions, you either have to reset it so we can remove the old versions from the all the patches.
Yep.
But this process, we have to work around it and automate something, but maybe it would be provided somehow out of the box.
Right. Yeah, we're working on adding reset functionality to changing build version as part of a reset. So that you could do it atomically where you would move the workflow back to an earlier stage and change the build in one flow.
Yeah. The idea here is to give you lots of options. So you can make a patch in your workflow code to make it backwards compatible with those existing executions. You can also write your long-running workflows to continue as new more frequently so that they just automatically will move to the newest version. And I think the reset API should allow you can do a batch reset specifying the build ID as a selector, and then have the new workflows would get started on the new default version as well.
If you were to use continue as new as you just described, is there a name for that technique?
I've been trying to make this a thing. I like to call this pattern trampolining, where you run your you start a workflow on one version, and then you do a little bit of work, and then you continue as new, and then you automatically will move to the next version. So you kind of trampoline between them, and that pairs really nicely with signal with start.
There was a question in the back, I think.
Do you want to use automated versioning? I saw Git hashes there, or would you ever want to use explicit versioning? And what are the circumstances where you'd want to choose between those?
Sorry.
Go for it.
So the philosophy with the Kubernetes controller is a little bit opinionated. It is determining versions automatically for you, and that's based on a checksum of the pod template. So we've noticed a lot of incidents actually where we just happened to create some difference in behavior in our workflow code because an environment variable changed, or just something outside of the code itself might have changed, which is why we're just giving you a version automatically that you don't have to configure. If you also tag your code with semantic versions, or have some other versioning scheme that you'd like to reflect in the versions that are shown in Temporal, then we could talk about maybe some way to template those. But I think the idea would be for each time you change anything about the pod template, it should be immutable between versions to make sure it's as safe as possible. But if you do multiple deploys and they're actually compatible with each other, one of the things we want to do is automatically move those workflow executions to the newest version if they are actually replay safe compatible, so that you can tear down the older deployment.
Temporal's underlying APIs have a concept called build ID, which is this build concept. It's less opinionated, so you can do whatever you want, but that's the best practice we know about, is what Jacob said. And if other people want to oh, this one's not really breaking, and have fewer versions or do semantic versioning, that's not something that that's definitely something you could do.
By the way, I talked about this at 2022 replay. This has been in progress for well over 2 years. And the original proposal was actually for semantic versioning, but we realized, we've already got this thing called build ID, and it's used for things like batch reset and stuff. So this allows you to integrate a lot better with existing operational tooling that we have.
We've got time for just one more quick question, and I've already got a asker of that question identified over here. But if you have follow-up questions after this session, both Drew and Jacob are on the community Slack, and there's the Save Deploys channel. It's a great place to ask them.
And also I want Carly and Shahab to stand up or wave so that people can. They are doing the actual work here, and they are also great to ask questions to.
Awesome. Is this SDK specific?
The controller is not SDK. Well, neither of them are SDK specific.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, cool.
Okay, well, thanks a lot to Jacob and Drew for such a great session, introducing a solution to a problem that a great many temporal developers have faced over the years. And I want you to give them a round of applause for that great presentation.